Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the 2020 California Labor Management Initiative Virtual Summit. We have a great day planned with several opportunities to connect with your own team and with leaders from across the state. To start, join me in welcoming Dr. Pedro Noguera. Pedro Noguera is a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. A sociologist, Dr. Noguera's research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 13 books. His most recent books are The Crisis of Connection with Niobe Way, Carol Gilligan, and Aisha Ali, and Race, Equity, and Education, the Pursuit of Equality in Education 60 Years After Brown. And he has published over 250 research articles, book chapters, research reports, and editorials. He serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations, including the Economic Policy Institute, the National Equity Institute, and The Nation magazine. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Noguera.
I want to thank Ed and Gustavo for inviting me, and LMI for bringing me back, and all of you for joining us in this virtual presentation. I'm going to use my remarks to talk today about what schools can be after the pandemic as we prepare for a reopening. I know that many of the district leaders out there are preoccupied with concerns about the logistics of reopening and how to keep schools safe and maintain distance and manage all of the complex issues that arise related to the operations. I'm going to focus my remark on the educational goals and particularly on equity and how do we ensure that this reopening, this reset, embarks us on a new way of serving all kids. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to start by thinking about how we plan for a different type of school, how do we begin to shift the paradigm when we think about the purpose of education differently, how to eliminate some of the barriers related to equity that we can anticipate will be there, and then why capacity building is such an essential part of this work. So let me start with a quote from Hugh Vasquez. Hugh Vasquez works with the National Equity Project, and he offers this. He says, since we know that disturbance is required for change, and there's no doubt that disturbance is happening as we speak, the question is, are we willing to use this as an opportunity to create the kind of education system we want? We have learned that if we are going to change a system, we as individuals first have to see what the system is producing. Then we have to engage with others to design something different. And finally, we have to act. I want you to think about that for a moment. My colleague Tony Bright likes to say that the schools we have been designed to get the results we get now. So if you think you're in a school with disparities in achievement related to race and class and language and culture, then what needs to change to start to eliminate those disparities? That's the question we're posing. And I want to follow this with a quote from Paul Revelle. Paul Revelle is the former Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts. And he says, how do we make our school, education, and child development systems more individually responsive to the needs of our students? Why not construct a system that meets children where they are and gives them what they need inside and outside of school in order to be successful? Let's take this opportunity to end the one-size-fits-all factory model of education. So I want to get you thinking about that, right? That is, the schools we have now have produced the results that we've been trying to change. What are we going to have to change? How do we create schools that are truly responsive to the needs of kids, not simply the academic needs, but to their social and emotional needs as well? That, to me, is a huge challenge. So the reason for this need for change is that the schools as we've known them have been characterized by deep and persistent disparities in achievement, the so-called achievement gap, which we know now is nothing more than an educational manifestation of social and racial inequality. We know that those inequities were exacerbated by the pandemic. Think about the kids that had no access to internet, no access to screen time, who didn't have support at home, and whose families were struggling with the uncertainty created by loss of jobs, potential loss of housing. These are the kids that we know are going to come back to us with greater needs. We know that in the old ways of doing things, that we use discipline primarily to address behavior problems, but often overlooked the causes of those behavior problems. And in many of our schools, what we do? We were disproportionately punishing the kids with the greatest needs. Kids who are in foster care, kids who are homeless, disproportionately African American students. And so one of the things we know by now is that denying kids learning time is not an effective intervention. How do we start thinking differently about discipline so that we are rebuilding relationships, keeping kids connected to learning, and at the same time keeping schools safe and orderly? Third, we've emphasized too much compliance and control, not just for children, but for teachers too, in too many districts, and not focused on how to empower teachers in the classroom so they can deliver meaningful instruction to kids, and how to empower students as learners so that they tap into their intrinsic need and motivation to learn. We've relied too much at the district and state level on pressure to foster accountability, on threats. We know clearly that doesn't work. What I'm going to talk about in a moment is how we can use capacity building as an alternative strategy. We need to change the culture of our schools so that they're less fragmented, less punitive, more student-centered, more building the morale of our staff so that they are better able to meet the needs of our kids. And finally, we need to really look at teaching and learning. Less focus on seat time, less focus on covering material, much more focus on deep engagement, because what we want is kids to come away with the love of learning, and not simply with having been prepared for a test. So this is a big change, and that's the reason why I say that to get there, it's going to require a paradigm shift. So I want you to think for a moment, how accurate are these characterizations of your schools and of your district? And if so, what are the equity challenges that you face that are going to need to be confronted if you're going to make progress? Each of you faces a different set of issues. You know your community, you know your schools. Where do we need to start and think about change? So the places where we know changes are going to be needed is that too often a child's background is predicting how well they'll do in school. And that tells us that schools, rather than serving as a way to build on the strengths of a child, are often reinforcing deficits. We know that in many of our schools, the culture and language kids bring with is not acknowledged, not recognized, not appreciated, or seen as a resource for learning. And instead, we focus on assimilating them and erasing that culture. We want to encourage you to think about culture as a resource for kids. And then we want to ask, what are we doing to inspire kids, to feed their curiosity? Because we know that curiosity can be a driver for achievement. And so we want to get you thinking, how do we tap into that intrinsic desire to learn that all kids have? The most common question you've ever heard from a child, a 3-year-old, is why? Why are things the way they are? And then finally, what are we going to do to help our teachers feel appreciated, given that they've been under stress too? Many of them have been working while attending to their own children. We want them to experience some joy and some passion in this work so they in turn can inspire our students. So these are the tall orders, but this is, I think, what's involved in moving in a new and better direction. To produce this shift in the paradigm, we're going to need to build in 3 core principles into our work. First of all, child development. Child development is at the foundation of education, but increasingly it's been left out. Several superintendents I've spoken to in recent weeks have said we're going to have to put Maslow ahead of Bloom. We have to think about the basic needs of children first, the needs that kids have for shelter, for security, for love, and for safety, so that we can get them into a position where they're learning and accessing those higher order thinking skills. So that holistic approach, that whole child approach is going to be really important. Secondly, we're going to have to draw on the neuroscience. The neuroscience reminds us that the brain is like a muscle, and that kids learn when that muscle, that brain is worked. Many kids have experienced learning loss because they haven't been engaged. They haven't been reading. And so we're gonna, just like any muscle you use that you haven't used in a long time, think about going running after you haven't run for several months, it's hard. Well, it's gonna be hard for several kids to get back up to speed, and we're gonna have to make sure that we pace ourselves appropriately. And then we're gonna have to think about the context. What's been happening in the lives of kids? What's been happening in their homes? How many of our kids have experienced insecurity related to food, related to the virus itself, related to loss of housing, and how has that impacted, or will that impact their learning? So all of these will be helpful in moving in this direction of this new paradigm that I've described. We're also going to have to think about the balance between the technical and the adaptive work. And those of you who are familiar with this concept, we know that the technical aspects of education often take precedent over the adaptive. And especially now, as we're concerned with logistics and operations, it's been very easy to think that if we just get that right, everything will be fine. Well, the adaptive work is where we provide support to our teachers, the way we work on relationships with our students. It's adaptive because it forces us to really put the time into building those relationships and make sure that every member of our team understands the vision, understands what we're trying to accomplish. You can't do that work by sending out an email. You actually have to talk to people. We have to talk to each other. We have to deliberate and problem solve together. So I really want to encourage you to think about how you're going to maintain a balance between the technical and the adaptive aspects of your job, because both are important. So some of the questions I know many of you are faced with, and I don't want to suggest at all that the logistical issues are not important, but managing social distance, keeping schools clean and sanitary, worrying about a staff who have compromised immune systems. These are critical issues. The one I want you to think about is this last one. If you had to make choices, if you have to make choices about which kids to bring back first, how are you going to prioritize? And if you decide we're going to prioritize the younger children first, or English learners, or kids with special needs, how are you going to communicate that to your community? Why you've made those decisions, so that they don't react by feeling that your decision making is unfair in some way. And so these are important considerations. I think after the pandemic, we can anticipate there's going to be an increase in mental health needs. And we know that now county mental health departments are seeing a huge spike in the number of people asking for help. And that's amongst adults. We can expect similar needs coming from children as well, who've been anxious and depressed and experiencing lots of mental health challenges as a result of this prolonged quarantine. We're going to experience learning loss. And we know that now that we're going to have a lot of kids who may not be motivated because they have not been motivated by Zoom distance learning. So what do we do about those kids? And how do we make sure that teachers are prepared to address the issue of racial injustice in society? Think for a moment, what would have happened if kids had seen the video that's out there of the police murder of George Floyd and then come back to school and wanted to talk about it? Would our teachers have been ready for that conversation? How would they have led that conversation? Well, now we have time to prepare. What are you going to do to make sure that if these issues haven't gone away, and I don't think they will, our teachers are ready for them? At the end of this presentation, I'm going to share some resources that you can share with your staff. But the main thing is we've got to get ready, because our kids are going to want to have these conversations about justice and about race in America. And then the most important question in some ways is, what do we need to know about the kids to get them ready for learning? How are they learning at home? Where were the gaps in learning? What are their social and emotional needs? And what is it going to take to rekindle their dreams and to get them motivated once again? Very important adaptive questions that require us to think deeply about the kids we serve. So again, later on you'll have time to talk about this in groups, but we want you to think about the equity challenges, the challenges that your teachers and other staff are going to face, that your students are bringing with them to school. that your parents have, and how you can address these concerns. Very important that we use the little time we have over the summer to be prepared. So I want to strongly encourage that you to think about how do you start by building a sense of community with your staff, with your kids. We know that it's so important for relationship building to check in. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Lots of us have been disconnected. And so coming back will bring up new anxieties about the return to work. Giving people a chance to name that is very important. One of the resources I'm going to share with you is an article about how to lead during a period of crisis and what leaders must do to support their staff and their communities. We want to give kids a chance to express themselves. We know from the research on trauma that one of the first tier responses to trauma is building the relationship, rebuilding the relationship with our students. And all of that is easier if we make that first few days of coming back joyful for kids. Bring some games in to make it a pleasant experience to be back in school. Give kids a chance to share their stories, their experiences, so that they reconnect and feel some pleasure about being back together again. So many of you have seen this chart, and it helps us to understand why equity is so important. We know that when we treat everyone the same, as the figure on the left shows, we invariably leave some kids out. What we don't see very often is this. Some people have some inherent advantages. And that, again, has been exposed during this pandemic. The people who had internet access, who have their own personal computers, who have tutors, who have college-educated parents with time to help them. Huge advantages compared to the kids who don't have those things. And those advantages will reinforce the disparities unless we're able to deliberately eliminate some of the barriers to learning. Now, that's where equity work lies, the elimination of barriers. So the most common barriers to equity in some ways are the most insidious, and that is complacency. And complacency often shows up as a tendency to blame parents, to blame kids, or to blame teachers for why we're not making more progress. Blame is not a strategy for improvement. And it's not to say that parents, teachers, and students don't bear responsibility, but what we want to focus on what they can do rather than simply blaming them. When we're blaming, it means we're not doing the work to address the needs of our students. Bias can be a barrier to equity. If we don't believe that kids can do it, if we don't believe that they're capable, then chances are they're not going to achieve. And often it's in lowered expectations. We should also acknowledge that sometimes they're not implicit bias, but explicit bias. There's racial hostility that may also be present. We need to confront that quickly, and in order to address it, kids don't work well for teachers that don't care about them and don't believe in them. A barrier is often the tendency to see teaching and learning as disconnected. Teaching is something I do, learning is something they do. No, you're only teaching when there's real evidence of learning. And when there's no evidence of learning, teachers need to stop, figure out why, what they need to do differently, how to intervene, turn to their colleagues for advice, for support, so that we ensure that the kids are learning. The punitive mindset we often see in schools about grading can be a real obstacle. A focus on equity reminds us that grading is not as important as feedback, giving students feedback on what they need to do to improve, and giving them numerous opportunities to revise and resubmit the work, because it's through that strategy that kids start to take greater ownership for the work product. Acknowledge that there's differences in equity, support outside of school. That could be a real barrier. Homework is an equity issue, and the kids with parents who can help them have a huge advantage of the kids who don't have that support. So we need to make sure we're aware of that, and to the degree we can, compensate for it. And then finally, if we ignore the basic needs of kids that impact the quality of their lives, chances are the kids with the greatest needs will continue to be the kids who do least well. So all of those are barriers. Important to again remember that equity is about giving kids what they need to be successful, acknowledging and addressing differences, responding to their emotional, their social, and their educational needs, being committed to fairness in the way we treat children, and this is really critical, speaking out when we see kids being denied the opportunity to learn, when we see injustice occurring in our schools. I know that that is a real challenge, but that's what real equity and justice requires. It requires those of us who are privileged to speak out when we hear injustice being expressed, or bias, racism being expressed by our colleagues. To the degree that we are silent, we contribute, we're complicit in the miseducation or undereducation of our children. It's not about lowering the standards, not about making excuses, not about choosing which kids to serve. Equity is about making sure that all kids, including the kids who are more advanced, are being challenged, being stimulated, and that we're doing our best to meet their needs. So if you have questions, we'll take this up later when we're all together. So after the pandemic, we want learning to be meaningful, we want it to be active, we want it to be relevant to their lives, because we know that when that happens, it sticks, right? And kids are much more likely to come away empowered as learners. We know that relationships are vital to that. The kids, many of our kids are relational learners. They'll work for the teachers they like and they know care about them. So we're going to have to maintain that holistic approach to education, where we recognize the social and emotional foundation of learning is linked to academic achievement. We need more learning that's collaborative, development of the higher order thinking skills in kids, and ultimately, we want kids to experience and hopefully develop a sense of mastery in learning, which is why I am a proponent of project-based learning, because it gives kids a product that they can say, this demonstrates what I've learned when they're finished. So after the pandemic, we're going to have to engage in capacity building with our staff. And if you follow the work of Michael Fullan, and he talks about the efforts in Toronto, the highest performing urban district in North America, that's been their approach. So we need to differentiate support to teachers, because they're not all the same. And we know that we've got to provide support in content for some, others need pedagogical support, many need relationship building support. You need all three to be effective, but not all teachers need the same things, just like our students don't all need the same things. Capacity building is also about building partnerships, because we can't expect schools or teachers to do this work by themselves. Universities can be partners to you in this work. Local businesses, churches, nonprofits, hospitals can all help you in areas where there are needs that kids have that schools don't have resources to fulfill. So we've got to be resourceful in figuring out how to get those needs met. And then finally, collaborative problem solving is an essential part of capacity building, because our principals and our teachers are going to see issues. The job of the central office administrators is to respond to those needs, not with threats, but with help. Right? And when we're all in on this together, when we have a sense of trust in how to do this work, we're much more likely to see progress over time. So the areas I would anticipate we're going to need help is in that whole child focus. We're going to have teachers who are still struggling with distance learning. They're going to need good professional development there, in cultural competence training, and then in moving towards a focus on really empowering kids as learners. And then I'm starting to wind down here, but I want you to start to think about how do we supplement learning opportunities for kids who've experienced learning loss, either through after-school activities, through tutoring. The kids, think about the kids with the IEPs, who we know their learning needs weren't met at all through distance learning. They're going to need more support, more time, and more tailored education that allows them to begin to recoup some of the learning loss. These are resources I think you'll find helpful, resources for distance learning. There's a lot of people who've been doing homeschooling for a long time. They can teach us a lot. I also have resources about related to race and how to talk to our kids about what they've seen and about policing in Black communities in particular. So I want to encourage you to be willing to turn to each other, turn to your communities, turn to me, turn to LMI for support as you reopen. We really have to commit ourselves to making schools better than they were before. This is an opportunity to do things differently. Let's not lose it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pedro. We really appreciate you being with us today and giving us your insight and keeping us focused on the needs of students. A couple questions that come to mind. In many ways, we have two pandemics, COVID and racial equity. As labor management teams and leaders are hopefully collaborating right now and developing reopening plans, they're addressing inequities that aren't new, but kind of really stand out in stark relief during this pandemic. What kinds of conversations would you hope are occurring regularly at these collaborative planning meetings?
So I think the conversations obviously have to deal with logistics, right? The logistics, I think, are taking precedent over everything, which is a problem, but understandable. Just think about how complex it's going to be to get schools open, keep them clean, keep people safe, provide assurances to staff that they're not going to get sick. And, there's a lot to be considered. At the same time, we've also got to think about how do we address the needs that kids are going to have when they return. And we know that there are a lot of kids who have been under great stress during this period, as well as their families, both financial stress as well as fears related to the virus. And then we have staff with similar concerns. And so it's going to be really important, I think, to do some work on building a sense of community, starting with the adults and then extending that to the children. So people feel safe, people feel supported. That's the context in which equity conversations needs to take place. If you don't build that sense of safety and support, it's very hard to have these critical conversations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see from a labor management perspective is the need to bring in diverse perspectives, both from the labor side and management. How can leaders model that idea that diverse perspectives increase, our capacity for decision making, both from the staff side and bringing in student voice and parent voice?
So, one of the contradictions in a lot of our schools is that we have a lot more diversity on the classified side than we do on the teaching side. And often the classified staff are parents in the district. They're from that community, and many times the teachers are not. Now, of course, there's a lot of variation out there. But it's because of those differences in the relationship that we have to the children and to the community, very important that we create a context where it's a level playing field for all members of the staff to communicate with each other. We need people who know and understand the children at the table with us. And that could be staff, that could also be parents. Because when you don't have adults who know the kids, understand their reality at the table, we often are relying on generalizations, stereotypes, assumptions that are often rooted in a biased or deficit perspective. And so I encourage you to really build that kind of level playing field for good, honest communication about the work we need to do.
Yeah, it seems that both students and staff have a real strong sense of fairness, kind of attuned to who has power and voice in our systems. How do we support and empower students and staff to engage in hard conversations around equity, race, and power?
So again, you can only have those hard, honest conversations if it's occurring amongst people who respect each other and people who are able to speak openly and freely about their experiences. If I'm a member of the custodial staff and I see things, but I don't think that I have the ability to be heard, I'll just keep silent. And I've seen that over and over again. Sometimes the people who have the best relationships with the kids are the lady in the lunchroom, because she knows those kids and she knows which kids are hungry. So you have to create this setting that the power dynamics are very important. Once we address that, then we can get at the critical issues around school discipline, around how we treat kids and how we engage kids, how we hold ourselves accountable for the work we do. So I think the difficult conversations are made more difficult when we don't address the power dynamics. When we do, then we can speak to each other as colleagues, as friends, and therefore, when difficult issues arise, we'll be less likely to get into name calling and adopting our positions, and much more open to hearing each other. And that, I think, is key, because we each bring different perspectives to what we see, and the power is in the dialogue across our differences.
Yeah. And I have one more before we go to Gustavo, who has some audience questions, and that is, you mentioned that schools will need to develop early intervention systems to identify supports for struggling students. What can school leaders be doing over the next few months to support staff in being able to build systems of response?
So I would say that first we have to anticipate what some of those needs are. We know there will be academic needs because of learning loss. A lot of kids were not engaged, not learning a lot, and therefore they're going to come to us behind. And some of them not in a frame of mind to go plug right into learning. So we're going to have to come in with plans. How do we address that? Some kids are going to come in with unmet social and emotional needs that have been exacerbated by the long quarantine. So we can anticipate some of what we'll experience. Then we need to be prepared when we see clear signs that kids are still not plugging into distance learning, because some schools may adopt a hybrid model. We'll have to, because they can't accommodate everybody. So we need to be able to address that early and quickly with kids. Similarly, we need good communication from parents so they can let us know what's working, what's not working for their children. And so we need to make sure we have good ways to communicate, that we are reaching out to them early before there's a problem, to let them know we want to hear from you about how your child is doing. So a lot of this is about communication and being proactive, not reactive.
Gustavo, I know you've gotten a lot of questions from the audience. Do you want to bring one or two up in the time we've got left?
All right. We've gotten a few questions about the budget. So I think Donna put it best with her question. When resources are limited, what does funding and staff allocation based on equity look like in a district?
This gets where it gets real hard. I think I always say, and I know many others say, our budgets should reflect our values and our priorities. One of the things that's interesting about this whole crisis is the whole idea that certain workers are essential. What's ironic about that, in many parts of the country, the essential workers are the lowest paid workers, right? They're not the bankers, they're not the athletes and entertainers, they're the grocery store clerks, the healthcare workers, et cetera, who are essential workers in our schools, right? That we can't function without. Well, custodians are going to be right at the top of the list because the schools have to be clean. Otherwise, we run the risk of spreading the virus. Teachers are going to be right at the top of the list because we can't do this without the teachers. But some teachers are going to be immunocompromised, and therefore we have to work with them to figure out, okay, maybe they have to do more virtual teaching. So I think prioritizing has to be done with thoughtfulness about how to best serve our needs, the needs of our kids, how to maintain a school that can function well. So equity is a primary concern, but there are other concerns related to health and safety that have to be considered as well.
Thank you. We have a second question from Blanca. how do we humanize the distance learning to ensure students feel connected and staff feel connected?
So I just posted an article about this yesterday, actually, but I got it from Edutopia. So I'd encourage you. They had an article about how to improve distance learning. I'd recommend it to those of you out there. And the article basically called for simple things like you start every lesson with a check-in. How are you doing? How's the class? And they gave some protocols, for example, of ways to do that keep kids connected to learning, but also let them know, I care about you. We're still doing the work of building the relationship with the student, which is so vital for learning. So I think that is what I would strongly recommend. We can't just launch into lessons without checking in. We can't simply tell kids what to do. We have to think about how do we motivate them to do it. It's different. Now, there are certain kids, if you're teaching an honors or an AP course, you may not need to do all the motivational parts, but you still should check in with kids. And I would strongly encourage that. We know that even before the pandemic, we were seeing a rise in the number of kids experiencing mental health challenges related to anxiety and depression. We know that's been exacerbated by the pandemic, and there are a lot more kids now with mental health challenges and adults as well. We see that from the calls for service in many counties right now.
And Ed, do we have time for one more?
Sure, go give us one more. I know we had some great questions from the audience, so let's take one more.
Yeah, and this one's from Mary. What are some ways educators can prepare faculties and staff about addressing issues of equity?
I think it starts by reminding everyone of the mission, right? Why are we here in the first place? We're here to educate kids, all kids. Nowhere in the mission does it say, except for the poor kids, or except for the Black kids, or except for the English learners. I don't know of any school that has a mission like that. So if that's why we're here, is to serve all the kids, then we have to ask, okay, who are these kids? And by that I mean, what are their needs, right? What do they bring? And what are we going to have to do to meet those needs? And you just frame it that way, and equity comes right to the surface. Because we know right away, some kids are coming with greater needs. Some kids are going to need more support. And by really being clear about who our students are and what we're going to need to support them, that also has implications for professional development and the kind of support systems we'll have to build in our schools. So the equity conversation is really a very basic conversation. Is what do we know about the students we serve? Because if we can align what we know about our kids with the resources and skills of the staff, then our schools are going to thrive.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for your insight, for joining us today. We hope that everyone that's watching has a chance to think about what you've said, to take that back into their own context and try and apply it as we go through the next coming months that we know are going to be extremely challenging for folks. So really appreciate your insight, and we will be in touch and hope to continue to connect and bring you to folks through the Labor Management Initiative.